All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling the roots of human civilization.
Big topic.
It is, but luckily, a listener sent in a great question that's going to guide us. How did humans go from those small, scattered groups to these complex societies? And to help us unpack that, we're turning to Friedrich Ratzel's The History of Mankind.
Ooh, a classic. I'm excited to dig into this one.
Me too. This book, just so everyone knows, is a really deep exploration of cultures from all over the globe. Many of them were considered, well, primitive back in Ratzel's time.
Yeah, and you know what's really fascinating about Ratzel? He actually challenges that label head on.
Oh, does he?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing these huge gaps between, like, quote-unquote primitive and advanced, he argues that human development's more like a continuous journey, a progression.
So less about us versus them and more about recognizing that we're all part of this shared story of progress.
Exactly, and he uses a really cool analogy to illustrate this point. He compares cultural development to links in a chain.
Links in a chain. I like that.
Each link is connected to the ones that came before and the ones that come after. No breaks in the chain. And we are all part of that chain, It's like your life today. It's built on the innovations of countless generations before you.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. I mean, it really makes you think about the bigger picture. But how does geography fit into all of this?
Well, Ratzel has a pretty surprising take on that, too. He suggests that the temperate zones, with their challenges in unpredictable weather, might have actually been the real cradle of civilization.
Wait, hold on. Not the tropics. I thought those areas, with all their abundant resources, were supposed to be the ideal place for societies to flourish.
You'd think so, right?
Huh.
But Ratzel argues that maybe the tropics were actually a little too comfortable, like a soft cradle.
A soft cradle.
Yeah, like things were so easy to come by that people didn't need to innovate as much. But when humans face tougher environmental pressures, they have to get creative to survive, leading to more sophisticated societies. He points to places like the high plateaus of Mexico and Peru as examples.
Okay, so he's saying that sometimes hardship can actually breed innovation.
Precisely. The land in those areas wasn't as fertile as the surrounding lowlands, so people had to develop more advanced farming methods and social structures just to thrive.
Fascinating. So what else did Ratzel find interesting about these so-called primitive cultures?
Well, he was really fascinated by their languages. He saw language as one of the truly defining features of humanity.
Yeah, and he delves into how language evolves, right? I mean, words becoming obsolete, meanings changing, entire languages even transforming over time.
He does. And he shares this hilarious anecdote about a Fijian battle cry. It's like, Saitava, Satava, Kayamat, Kayaya Abure. The thing is, nobody actually knows what it means anymore.
They're just yelling gibberish at each other.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But with a lot of passion. But there's a deeper point there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ratzel suggests that the complexity of a language can actually reflect the complexity of a society.
So it's not just about the number of words, but how those words are used to express complex ideas and concepts. That makes sense. What about religion? How did Ratzel approach the development of religious beliefs?
He argued that many religious practices stem from a basic human need to explain the mysteries of life and death. Especially when you don't have scientific explanations readily available.
Right, like trying to make sense of the world around you when you don't understand why things happen.
Exactly. And fear can be a major driver in those situations, right? Fear of the unknown, fear of death, even fear of the dead. It leads to superstitions and rituals as a way of coping.
So if you can't control the things you're afraid of, at least you can try to appease them or understand them through rituals and beliefs. It's about finding a way to manage those fears, right?
Absolutely. And that's where figures like shamans and medicine men step in. They act as these intermediaries between the world of the living and the spirit world, offering explanations, performing rituals, trying to maintain balance.
It's like they're the original explainers of the unexplainable, and their role seems to pop up across so many different cultures, which is really interesting. But Ratzel doesn't dismiss these beliefs as simply primitive superstition, does he?
Not at all. Instead, he sees them as evidence of this innate human curiosity, like a deep-seated desire to understand the world around us, to find meaning in it all. That's a universal human drive.
A search for meaning that transcends cultural boundaries. It's a really beautiful way of looking at it. Instead of judging these beliefs as right or wrong, he's encouraging us to try to understand them, to see them as part of this larger human story.
I think that's a really important point.
It is. Now, I'm curious about his take on art in these, quote, less technologically advanced societies. He pushes back against the idea that it's merely decorative, doesn't he?
He does, and quite forcefully. He sees a lot of what we call primitive art as a sophisticated system of symbols and storytelling. It's like a precursor to writing.
So it's not just pretty pictures, it's actually conveying information, preserving knowledge, transmitting cultural values.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that art, in any form, can hold deeper meanings beyond just aesthetics. It can be a powerful tool for communication and connection.
It makes you wonder how much of that symbolic language we've lost over time, or just haven't learned to decipher. It's like a whole other world of meaning waiting to be unlocked. Now, speaking of unlocking new perspectives, Ratzel's take on the origins of agriculture is pretty interesting. He talks about early humans trying to bottle up their food sources rather than actively cultivating them. What did he mean by that?
He was challenging this idea that the shift to agriculture was like a sudden revolution. Instead, he argued it was a more gradual process. Humans started by managing existing food sources, like protecting wild plants or encouraging their growth in certain areas.
So it's less about planting seeds and more about tending to what's already there. Like he uses that example of Australian tribes who wouldn't uproot fruit-bearing plants, right? They just let nature do its thing and came back to harvest.
That's a great example. It shows a deep understanding of and respect for the natural world. And it highlights that the transition to agriculture wasn't just about technology or technique, but about a fundamental shift in how humans viewed their relationship with the environment.
So it's a shift from exploiting resources to nurturing them.
Exactly. And as that shift happened, it led to all sorts of other changes. Villages became more permanent, populations grew, and the need for more complex social structures arose.
It's almost like a chain reaction, right? Each change leading to new innovations and challenges.
Absolutely. It's this fascinating interplay between human ingenuity and environmental pressures.
Now, speaking of social structures, Ratzel doesn't shy away from exploring the complexities of family systems across cultures. He talks about polygamy and this concept of mother right, which is really intriguing. What exactly is mother right?
It's basically the idea of tracing lineage and inheritance through the mother's side of the family rather than the father's. It might sound unusual to us, but it was a fairly common practice in many cultures throughout history.
It's definitely different from the family structures we're used to in many parts of the world today. He even talks about some tribal societies where a son might end up fighting against his own father in a feud because his primary loyalty is to his mother's clan.
Yeah, that example really throws our typical assumptions about family and kinship out the window. But it highlights that there's no one-size-fits-all model for family. These structures evolve based on a whole range of factors.
So what we might consider normal is actually just one variation among many possibilities. It's about expanding our understanding of what family can mean.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that these different family structures have real social and political implications, shaping inheritance, power dynamics, and the overall structure of a society.
Now, on a related note, I know Ratzel also looked at the concept of property and ownership and how these ideas varied across cultures. What were some of his key observations there?
Well, he challenges this assumption that property and ownership are always about individual rights. He points out that for nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, for example, communal ownership makes a lot more sense.
Right, because they rely on vast territories to sustain themselves. It wouldn't be practical to divide up the land into individual plots if they're constantly on the move.
Exactly. So the best approach to ownership depends on the specific needs and resources of a given society. It's not a one-size-fits-all concept.
Which is a really interesting point, especially considering how much emphasis is placed on individual property rights in our modern world. It makes you wonder if that model is always the most sustainable or equitable. Maybe there's something to be learned from cultures that have thrived for centuries on principles of sharing and communal responsibility.
That's definitely a question worth pondering, and it's something that Ratzel himself seems to hint at in his work. He's prompting us to think critically about our own assumptions and consider alternative ways of relating to property and resources.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground with Ratzel's ideas about the early stages of human civilization, from the role of geography and language to the evolution of family structures and concepts of ownership, and it seems like there's still so much more to unpack.
There is. Buckle up, because in the next part of our deep dive, we'll continue exploring Ratzel's insights.
And we're back, continuing our deep dive into Friedrich Ratzel's The History of Mankind. We've been on this fascinating journey tracing those early steps of human civilization. From the power of language to the ways family structures developed and how those ideas about ownership took shape, it's been quite the ride. But Ratzel doesn't stop there.
Mm.
Oh no, he dives even deeper into these really complex topics like religion and art, and he really challenges us to see them in a whole new light. What were some of those insights that really stood out to you?
His observations about religion, they're particularly fascinating. He suggests, and I think this is a key point, that so many religious practices actually come from this basic, fundamental human need.
What do you mean?
This need to grapple with those big mysteries, life and death. Especially in societies that hadn't developed, say, scientific explanations for the world around them.
So it's about trying to find some kind of order, make sense of a world that can feel really chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly. And he highlights fear as this powerful, powerful driver of superstition and ritual.
Fear?
Oh yeah, fear of the unknown, that fear of death, even fear of the dead themselves. These primal fears, they often find expression in those religious beliefs and practices.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually, if you don't understand why things are happening, like a natural disaster or a sudden illness.
Right.
It's natural to try to find explanations, look to the supernatural realm.
Makes sense.
And maybe those rituals, they give you a sense of control or comfort in the face of those fears.
Right, and it's in this context that you see figures like shamans and medicine men emerging.
Yeah.
Those folks, they act as these intermediaries between the world we live in and the spirit world, offering explanations, performing rituals, trying to keep everything in balance.
Fascinating how that role seems to appear in so many cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Each one with their own unique set of traditions, but all tapping into that human need to connect to something beyond what we can see and touch. But Ratzel doesn't just write these beliefs off as like, oh, that's just primitive superstition, does he?
No, not at all. Instead, he sees them as this reflection of human curiosity, a reflection of our enduring quest, trying to understand our place in the universe. That's a search for meaning that crosses all those cultural boundaries.
He's urging us to look at these practices with empathy, with understanding, instead of judgment. It's about recognizing that human element, that search for meaning, that search for connection. It's beautiful, really.
It is.
But he doesn't shy away from addressing, some of those practices that we might find difficult today. I mean, he mentions human sacrifice, even cannibalism.
That's tough to grapple with those concepts from our modern perspective, absolutely.
It is.
But he urges us to consider that context.
This historical and cultural context, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, what might seem abhorrent to us now, it could have been seen as a sacred duty in another time and place.
Yeah.
Our judgments about right and wrong, they're shaped by our own cultural lens.
That's such a crucial point. It's a reminder that human history, it's complicated, it's nuanced. We can't just impose our own values onto the past. So kind of shifting gears a bit, I'm really interested in his take on art, specifically in those societies that weren't, as technologically advanced.
Yeah.
He seems to be pushing back against this idea that, these cultures just weren't as intellectually or creatively developed.
Absolutely. He argues that a lot of what gets labeled as primitive art is actually a really complex system. A system of symbols, of storytelling. He sees it as a precursor to writing, like a visual language that can convey meaning, preserve knowledge, even transmit values across generations.
So it's not just decoration. It's like a window into their minds, into their culture. They're recording their history, their beliefs, their whole understanding of the world through this visual language.
Precisely. It challenges us to look at art, any art really, whether it's ancient or modern, with fresh eyes, to look beyond the surface and search for those deeper layers of meaning, the symbolism.
To appreciate the power of that visual language makes you wonder how much of that we've lost over time. Or maybe just never learned to see in the first place. But it also highlights the importance of protecting these cultural treasures, right? So we can continue to learn from them. Now, let's talk about his observations on agriculture and cattle breeding. He makes this interesting distinction between managing existing food sources versus intentional cultivation.
Right.
It's not quite as straightforward as we might think, is it?
It isn't. I mean, he's challenging the assumption that the shift to agriculture, it was this sudden revolution. Instead, he suggests it was a more gradual evolution.
So starting with managing wild food sources and then moving towards actually cultivating those crops.
Right. Like that example he gives, the Australian tribes who wouldn't uproot those fruit-bearing plants.
Yeah, it's almost like sustainable foraging in a way.
Right. They understood the natural world and they respected it. They wanted to make sure those resources were available for future generations. And it highlights that the move to agriculture, it wasn't just about developing new techniques. It was about a fundamental change in the way humans saw their place in nature.
It's a shift from taking what you need to actually nurturing those resources.
Exactly. And as that shift took hold, it led to all sorts of changes. More permanent villages, population growth, a need for more complex social structures.
It's like one thing leads to another, setting off this whole chain of events that shaped human history. Now, speaking of social structures, Ratzel really dives into the fascinating world of family systems across different cultures.
Doesn't he?
He talks about polygamy, which we've touched on before, but also this concept of mother right, which is so interesting. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So mother right is basically tracing lineage and inheritance through the mother's side of the family, not the father's. Now, it might seem unusual to us today, but it's actually pretty common in a lot of cultures throughout history.
And he even gives that example, that striking example of those tribal societies where a son might find himself fighting against his own father because his loyalty lies with his mother's clan.
Powerful example, right? It completely flips our typical ideas about family on their head. But it shows that there's no one right way to define family. Those structures, they evolve based on so many factors: social, economic, environmental, you name it.
So what we might consider normal is just one variation among many, many possibilities. It's a reminder that family structures, they're fluid, they're adaptable.
Absolutely. And those different structures, they have real impacts, shaping everything from inheritance to power dynamics within a society.
Okay, last thing I want to touch on before we move on. I know Ratzel also explores the concept of property and ownership and how those ideas differed across cultures. What were some of his key observations there?
Well, he challenges this assumption that property and ownership always have to be about individual rights. For example, in nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, communal ownership is the norm.
Which makes sense, right? They need vast territories to support themselves, constantly moving around. Dividing up land into individual plots wouldn't really be practical.
Exactly. So the best way to handle ownership, it really depends on the specific needs of a society, right? What works for one group might not work for another.
Which is such an interesting point, especially considering how much we emphasize individual property rights in our modern world. Makes you wonder if there's something we could learn from those cultures that thrived for centuries on shared resources and communal responsibility. Maybe our current model isn't always the most sustainable.
Big questions.
Yeah.
And I think those are exactly the kinds of questions Ratzel's pushing us to think about, challenging those assumptions, considering those alternatives.
It's about recognizing that there isn't always one right answer, one right way to do things.
Precisely.
Now, before we get to our final part, I just want to highlight something that really stood out to me about Ratzel's work. It's this idea of intercourse as a driving force for cultural development.
That cross-pollination of ideas, that exchange of knowledge, you mean?
Exactly. That idea that innovation comes from interaction, that we need to challenge our assumptions, broaden our horizons, and create something new by engaging with other cultures, other ways of thinking. It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
I love that. And Ratzel argues that this kind of intercourse is not just about practical things like trade or technology.
No.
It's also about sharing stories, sharing beliefs, values.
It's through those cultural exchanges that we really learn from each other, build empathy, create a more connected world. It highlights the power of travel, of storytelling, just being open to learning from those who are different from us. But it also raises a really interesting question, doesn't it?
Go on.
What happens to cultures that are isolated? If that exchange of ideas is so crucial for progress, how do they evolve? What unique perspectives might they offer?
Those are fantastic questions.
Yeah.
It really makes you think.
And I think they're perfect food for thought as we head into our final part of this deep dive. We'll be right back after a short break. All right, welcome back to our final part of this deep dive with Friedrich Ratzel's The History of Mankind. It's been quite the journey exploring those early stages of human civilization.
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure.
We have, but now I'm kind of curious, if we had to, distill Ratzel's key ideas, what would you say those are, the most important takeaways from all of this?
Well, one of the biggest things that Ratzel drives home, I think, is that cultures are way too complex, way too nuanced to just slap labels on them, like primitive or advanced.
Right.
We've seen how geography, language, religion, all those social structures, even the art forms, it all comes together to create this tapestry.
A tapestry, I like that. So it's not just one element, it's the combination of all these things working together.
Precisely. And it's not a static tapestry either. It's constantly changing.
Oh, evolving, adapting.
Exactly. Cultures are dynamic. They're fluid, always responding to those pressures, internal and external. And one of the key drivers of that evolution, as we've talked about, is intercourse between cultures.
That exchange of ideas, knowledge, even just people moving around.
Right. And it makes you think, doesn't it, about the role of globalization in our world today. Is it causing cultures to become too similar, or is it creating new opportunities for blending and innovation?
That's a really good question. It's a complex issue for sure. But Ratzel's work does give us this framework, a way to think about it all.
It does. It reminds us that cultures are always in motion, always adapting to new circumstances. And I think another important takeaway that really comes through in his writing is this sense of appreciating that incredible diversity.
The diversity of human experience.
Yeah, there's no one right way to be human. There's no single path to progress. What might seem strange or backward to us could actually be a source of strength, a source of resilience in another culture.
So it's not about judging or ranking cultures, it's about understanding them, appreciating what makes them unique.
Precisely. It's about approaching that cultural exchange with respect, a genuine desire to learn, recognizing that each culture has something valuable to teach us.
Before we wrap up, there's one more point that I wanted to touch on, something Ratzel said that really stuck with me. He emphasizes that this intercourse, this exchange, it's not just about spreading knowledge, it's about preserving it too. He uses this really interesting metaphor comparing cultural development to hoarding.
Hoarding.
Yeah. Each generation builds upon those achievements of the ones who came before. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, right?
A great metaphor. It reminds us that we inherit this vast storehouse of knowledge, of experiences, and it's our responsibility to build upon it.
But it also brings up a question, and it feels especially relevant today, with all the information overload we face. How do we decide what's worth preserving?
With all the information bombarding us constantly, how do we figure out what's truly valuable? What deserves to be carried forward?
Exactly. It's not just about gathering more and more facts. It's about cultivating wisdom, cultivating understanding.
I think Rassel's work challenges us to be more mindful of the knowledge we create, that we consume, the knowledge we share with others.
So as we close out our deep dive into Ratzel's The History of Mankind, I'm just left with this sense of awe, really. The sheer vastness, complexity of human civilization. It's amazing.
It is. This tapestry woven from all these threads, geography, language, religion, art, social structures, all intertwined, constantly evolving.
And it's never finished, is it?
Never. There's always more to learn, new perspectives to consider, new connections to make.
Ratzel has definitely inspired me to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep trying to understand this amazing world and the people in it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep seeking out those moments of insight and wonder. You never know what you might discover.